My name is Dean Serwin. I'm the chair of the BHBA's Wellness section, freshly back from Costco, and ready to introduce our program today and our speaker. The program today is Training, Attention, and Exercising Professional Agency, Mindfulness for Lawyers, kind of part two from a program we did literally exactly 1 year ago today with Emily Keene. I'll introduce her in a moment. First, I want to tell you a little bit about the BHBA and about the Wellness section. Wellness is a new optional competence element to the competence requirements for MCLE. And we're very excited about it because it's something that we feel is very important. As I've been sitting through some of these programs, comments, questions, feedback from the participants has indicated that this is an area that impacts a lot of lawyers. So welcome. A little bit about BHBA. We do these programs every day. We have 1 to 3 a day, sometimes, most of the time, and we'll do them. If a new case comes down, something important happens in any field of law, we'll probably have a program on it within a week. We also have a wonderful, for those of you like myself that are in the compliance to do in 20 days now. BHBA On Demand is kind of like YouTube for MCLE, except unlike a lot of those services that you're probably inundated with emails from, these programs are new, fresh, exciting things, well produced. A lot of those are horribly produced. Regardless, you can go into the BHBA On Demand, find things like this, those hard to get areas of your MCLE. They're all considered participatory, so you get that credit as well. And the beauty of it is once you watch it, it's in sort of a little digital locker that you've done it. And then when it comes time to do the compliance with the bar, it's a couple of clicks. It takes about a minute to certify your MCLE. So that's fantastic. Watch for more programs from the Wellness Committee. And if you're interested, we are going to start having committee meetings the third Wednesday of each month. So we'll start with the 25th of this month. So reach out to the bar if interested in participating. With that, I will tell you there are materials. Those materials have been sent to you by email. If you missed that email for any reason, they're also in the chat, and they'll be periodically posted in the chat. So just scroll back on the chat and you can find it. They'll also be posted in the Q&A, I believe. And you should receive your certificate for this. Might be tomorrow since it's already end of the day today. And then it'll be in the BHB On Demand shortly thereafter. So if you want to rewatch it, if you want to send your friends, colleagues, acquaintances, partners, associates, etc. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker once again, Emily Keene. Emily Nagasi Keene is Assistant Dean for Law Student Affairs, leading the Law Student Affairs and Academic Success and Bar Program offices at the University of San Diego Law School. She provides strategic leadership for programs and services that foster academic and bar success and oversees law student life, academic advising, and student accommodations and well-being. Keene teaches the course, Contemplative Practice of Law, which helps students to develop mindfulness and meditation practices, develop ethically, and increase their professional resilience. Very excited to have her back again with us. I will be monitoring the Q&A, but otherwise we'll have a Q&A section at the end. Take it away, Emily.
Great. Thank you so much, Dean. Okay, I'm just going to share my slides, make sure I can do this correctly. Everyone can see the slides, I hope. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, great. Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much especially to Dean and the Beverly Hills Bar Association for inviting me back 1 year exactly to the day since I last presented, and to continue a conversation that's really important to me. 15 years ago, I really couldn't imagine leading a session like this. I'm not what you would have considered to be someone who was well or unstressed, right? I was working as a human rights lawyer in South Africa, spending long hours in the field, working in prisons, policing, and intervening in the wake of abuses in a way that was like pretty psychologically brutal. And on the surface, I was really sustained by what felt like deep care and moral clarity. And absolutely, that was what motivated me. But beneath that, I really was struggling. I was encountering resistance on multiple levels. Resistance from the public in terms of indifference to what I witnessed, institutional resistance to accountability, and my own resistance to my own human limits. My limits, the limits of the work, the limits of what an individual can repair, or how much I could help. And my mind and body really absorbed the cost, not to mention, my personal and family life. I struggle with insomnia, regular migraines, chronic urticaria, ulcers, you name it. And my stress was really showing up in terms of my body. And it took me a while to kind of push past that and actually do something really meaningful about it. I continued on, and I treated the kind of intensity of my work as evidence of my value, evidence of my seriousness, evidence of my integrity. And what I didn't understand at the time was how much my own mind was actually amplifying the strain. The external conditions I was navigating were difficult enough, but the internal conditions was really what was relentless. I replayed suffering I couldn't help. When I failed, I mentally relitigated events that were already over. I carried narratives long after the moment had passed, and my mind treated those narratives as obligations I had to see through. And I couldn't stop working because I thought it meant I failed to help. So it took a while, but I eventually kind of encountered and tried meditation at a time when my body had made it really clear that something had to change. And when therapy, intense exercise, and burning the candle on both ends just really weren't sufficient anymore. So I went on a 10-day silent meditation retreat to learn how to meditate and to learn what, quite frankly, I didn't know how to do, which was how to relate to my own mind without being pulled by it. And the big insight was pretty straightforward from that retreat, but it had a very profound effect on my life. The factual pain I encountered in the world was plenty enough on its own, but I was generating additional pain through my mind's compulsive tendencies, through rumination, fixation, and the internal insistence, even when nothing further could be done. The events were real, but the mental suffering that I was inflicting on myself was entirely optional. Now, that insight did not completely erase old patterns, but what changed first was my body. The migraine stopped, the hives stopped, the ulcers healed, my blood pressure stabilized. In fact, I haven't had a migraine since 2014. At the same time, habits return very easily, and they don't dissolve because of one moment of clarity, no matter how profound. But what I did learn, and what matters for this session, is that the mental habits can be trained. Space can be created between stimulus and response. And within that space, something like freedom becomes available. The capacity to choose how one responds rather than being pulled reflexively into reaction. And so that's the subject for today, professional agency. And by agency in this presentation, I mean the capacity to recognize internal mental and emotional activation and to respond deliberately, conscientiously, rather than reacting automatically. In adversarial professions, exercising agency here can shape the tone and the tenor of our interactions, strategy, judgment, ethical consistency, and it also shapes how it feels for us as individual human beings living inside of this work. So let me briefly orient us to the session. We'll begin with mindfulness, neuroplasticity, and what's going on in a lawyer's mind, how attention functions under pressure, and how mental habits can be trained using meditation. I'll then introduce a framework from cognitive science, the modular theory of the mind, which helps explain why strong emotions can quickly capture our attention. And we'll look at simple techniques that make those processes more visible and can disarm those strong emotions once they've taken hold. From there, we'll turn to Stoicism as a complement to mindfulness practice. Stoic philosophy offers a helpful account of how perception becomes judgment and how judgment becomes action. And we'll try a couple of Stoic exercises there. And finally, we'll consider community, connection, and compassion, and how widening the frame of our perception can reduce unnecessary hostility in adversarial settings and contribute to our own sense of calm and increased ability to collaborate. Throughout this session, we'll pause briefly to try a few short practices. Obviously, it's only an hour, we're not mastering anything, but it's just to experience how shifts in our attention and interpretation affect how the mind operates under pressure. Over time, practices like these can strengthen what we might call professional agency, the capacity to recognize internal activation, examine interpretation, and respond deliberately. So in that sense, the training is also a training in freedom of mind, the ability to work within demanding environments without being carried entirely by their pressures. So mindfulness. In contemporary Western language, it's commonly defined as moment-to-moment awareness of our thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensation without judgment. Within legal culture, structured around critique, competition, and constant evaluation, the practice of observing our internal states without immediately condemning them can be a meaningful salve on its own. Many of us are skilled at analyzing external problems, but we're less practiced at noticing what's unfolding internally while we analyze. And some of us might be outright resistant, to see what's actually there, and we're trying to avoid it at all costs. Historically, mindfulness developed within a 2,500-year-old tradition concerned with wisdom and ethical and spiritual development. And in terms of what's taught in most mindfulness circles in America and the West, it's really from a Buddhist tradition. Meditation in that context is a method of training the mind, learning how to observe its activity with calm attention and learning how to redirect our attention with wisdom and discernment. So the point of looking inward, it's not self-absorption, it's not navel gazing, it's to understand how our mind works, refine how it behaves, and refine how we behave outwardly, particularly when our mind is under stress and inclined toward distortion. For lawyers, this has very practical implication. The profession places us in evaluative and emotionally charged environments, and our nervous systems respond accordingly, and then we pay with our health. To understand how this agency can be trained, it helps us to look briefly at how the mind operates under pressure. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman describes two broad modes of cognition: fast, automatic processing, and slower, deliberative reasoning, or type 1 and type 2 thinking. The fast system operates quickly and efficiently. It draws on emotion, habit, and pattern recognition. The slower system engages when we analyze, weigh options, and consider consequences. It's our rational reasoning side. In contentious exchanges, fast processing often arrives first. An email reads as accusatory. A judge interrupts us mid-sentence. Opposing counsel is using a dismissive tone. In these moments, before deliberative reasoning has fully engaged, the nervous system registers a threat. And this activation involves structures such as the amygdala in our brain, the small little walnut lizard part of our brain. The sympathetic nervous system mobilizes, our heart rate increases, our muscles tighten, our cognitive bandwidth narrows. And then the pathways associated with strong emotion activate faster than the slower processes associated with reflective reasoning. These sympathetic responses evolved to support our survival as a species. But in professional settings, they're frequently disproportionate to the stimulus, and we're flooded with stress, and the quality of our decisions and interactions end up suffering, and then we start to experience distress. Breathing patterns influence this cascade. Slow, deliberate breathing with extended exhalations stimulate the vagus nerve, increasing our parasympathetic activity, our rest and digest, our calming response. And it supports our physiological regulation. So as the body stabilizes, access to our higher order reasoning improves, and this is measurable in our physiology. So a really important thing we can do any time of day is to slow down our breathing. So let's start with some 4-7-8 breathing to settle down our nervous systems. And this is very simple. There have been lab studies about different breathing techniques. This is one of the ones that's supposed to be the most effective. And you inhale through your nose for the count of 4, you gently hold for the count of 7, and then you slowly exhale through your mouth like you're blowing through a straw for the count of 8. So let's try this for a couple of cycles. So inhale to the count of 4, hold for the count of 7, exhale for 8. Inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8. And one last time. Inhale, hold, exhale. This is what I was doing before the presentation. Attention functions as another regulatory mechanism, and our attention is trainable. Neuroscientists use the term the default mode network to describe a set of interconnected brain regions that become active when we're not engaged in a specific external task. When attention is not anchored, the mind defaults to internally generated activity, much of which takes the form of self-referential narrative. This narrative activity supports autobiographical continuity, planning, moral reasoning, and the simulation of outcomes. It also allows us to learn from experience and anticipate consequences. But it also has a predictable shadow side, rumination, looping self-evaluation, and repetitive rehearsal. For lawyers, it's a pretty familiar pattern. A hearing concludes and the argument continues internally for hours. A comment from opposing counsel repeats itself long after the exchange is over, like a marble circling in an empty bathtub. An anticipated cross-examination unfolds in imagination days before it happens. And then we end up experiencing these hypothetical scenarios with the similar urgency of current threat. Default mode activity is especially pronounced in self-referential thinking. The mind begins asking questions of status and identity. How did that reflect on me? What does this mean about my competence? What will people think? When the mind wanders, it often wanders in predictable grooves: evaluation, comparison, self-critique, and the attempt to regain control through rehearsal. Persistent activation of these loops correlates with anxiety and decreased well-being. More importantly for our purposes, it also narrows our perception. When the mind is absorbed in narrative, incoming information is processed through the story rather than assessed on its own terms. Meditation doesn't eliminate default mode activity, but what practice can change is the degree to which the mind is carried by it and the speed with which one recognizes that a loop has taken hold. And repeated attentional training reduces the automatic dominance of narrative, and it strengthens circuits associated with executive control and present-centered awareness. The effect is gradual. What becomes noticeable over time is an increased ability to disengage from narrative when it's not serving the work. And this capacity obviously has professional consequences. If you can recognize that you're mentally replaying a perceived slight, you can decide whether continuing to do so serves you or the role you're playing. And you can return your attention to preparation or productivity rather than perseveration. Focused attention meditation trains the capacity to direct attention deliberately. It's pretty simple. You choose an object of attention. Most commonly, what I encourage people to focus on is the breath, because the breath is always with you. You don't need any special equipment. You don't need to be in a special room or doing this special thing. You're always able to access your breath, which means you can do this anywhere. And you just choose an object of your attention, your breath, and you sustain your attention there. Distraction will occur, recognition of that distraction will occur, and then you return your attention back to your anchor, your breath. Despite how simple it is, several cognitive processes are being trained simultaneously. Selective attention is strengthened by repeatedly choosing the object of attention rather than allowing attention to be captured automatically. Meta-awareness is trained by recognizing that attention has drifted. Inhibitory control is trained through the act of interrupting the momentum of thought and returning to a chosen object. Each time attention wanders to planning, memory, or evaluation, default mode activity has engaged. Each time that engagement is recognized and attention is returned, executive networks are being recruited. Over time, the latency between distraction and recognition shortens. Instead of being carried for minutes by a narrative, the mind recognizes the drift much earlier. So for lawyers, say, for example, during an oral argument, your attention drifts into internal commentary about performance and outcome. This practice supports your ability to return to the actual question being asked or what's going on. During negotiations, your mind starts constructing a narrative about disrespect or status. This practice supports returning to the terms on the table and the objectives of the role that you're playing. After work, when your mind keeps replaying the day, this helps you recognize the onset of rumination and allows you to redirect your attention towards rest and restoration. It's incremental work. No single session is going to transform your mind, but the effect accumulates through repetition and through practice. You're training a new habit of your mind. So with that, let's spend about 2-3 minutes just working on the meditation. And you can sit comfortably in your chair. Let your hands rest easily in your lap. Have your back straight but not rigid. Relax, but with just enough tension so that you don't get sleepy. And if you're comfortable, you can close your eyes or simply lower your gaze. And you can begin by bringing your attention to your breath. And treat your breath as a place where your mind can settle down, like a comfortable home base. Notice your breath coming in all the way, and notice the breath going out all the way. There's no special breath you have to do. Just breathe however is natural and comfortable to you right now. And when your breath feels comfortable, and adjust it if you need to, deeper, shallower, faster, slower. See what feels best. Once your breath feels comfortable, it's going to be easier for your mind to stay there. And so for the next 2-3 minutes, just follow your attention with your breath. And if your mind wanders, just drop the thought that it's picked up and gently, without chastisement, without disappointment, come back to your breath again and again. When you're ready, you can open your eyes and come back. With this practice, you very quickly notice how much the mind wanders. And it's completely normal. Your mind's been trained to move quickly from one thing to another for your whole life. So the entirety of the practice is just to notice when your mind's wandered and to bring it back again and again. No need for irritation or commentary about what that means for you. Our minds are going to wander. Every return you bring to your breath after you're distracted strengthens your mind's ability to stay where you intend for your mind to stay. And the point is not to achieve perfect concentration. That might sometimes happen. But other times, even for really experienced meditators, you're going to sit down and you're going to try to meditate, and it's just not going to happen. So then you're just training your mind again to focus on what you wish for your mind to focus on, which is your breath. So it's really helpful to do this, whenever you can, a few minutes at your desk. But the best thing to do is to establish a daily practice, even if it's for 5 to 10 minutes. You want to work on this because you want to build a new practice, a new habit in your mind, and you want to train your mind to be directed to where you want it to be directed to. And so even with that brief meditation, we observe the busyness of our minds and the internal conflicts that often are taking place in our minds. A useful framework for understanding that kind of busyness and conflict is the modular theory of the mind, described in popular form by writers like Robert Wright. The concept is about how our minds evolved. Our mind was not designed as a single, unified, perfect executive system. It evolved in layers with semi-independent processes solving different adaptive problems. What we experience as a coherent self is more accurately a shifting coalition of processes that rise and fall depending on the context. Different modules activate under different conditions. A fairness detection system becomes alert in negotiations. A status monitoring system intensifies in hierarchical environments. Threat detection responds to perceived disrespect. And a self-protective narrative generator mobilizes when our identity starts to feel challenged. When one of these systems is active, it tends to feel very authoritative. It generates reasons, justifications, and narratives that support its immediate aim, which is to take control of the steering wheel of our mind. In a contentious exchange, for example, a fairness system may generate a story about injustice. A status system may supply anxiety about how one is being perceived. And the defensive system starts to assemble counter-arguments before the other person has even finished speaking. Each of these systems has adaptive value. But the difficulty arises when one system captures the field of attention and drives conduct without oversight. Usually, one of these modules takes over our attention when there's a strong emotion animating it to the front of our minds. Our minds are really more like a shouting house of representatives rather than a single executive at the helm. Or a shouty boardroom where there's always at least one or two obnoxious types who take up all the oxygen in the room. Mindfulness increases visibility of these shifts and of these voices. It reveals that what feels like a singular, stable I is often a rapid succession of impulses, interpretations, and emotions. From that vantage point, agency becomes less about suppressing emotion and more about deciding which internal processes should guide action in a given role. And we have agency to say no to one of the modules, to one of the shouty board members, to let it know you've been heard. Now let's let a different person speak. In legal practice, the part of you that wants to win an exchange is not always the part best aligned with client interest or long-term credibility. And the part of you that wants to defend status is not always aligned with judgment or what's going to be most effective in the moment. One practical technique that works directly with this modular structure is in-the-moment labeling. So labeling is simple in form, but kind of demanding in execution, especially when you're a little riled up. When a thought or emotion arises, you briefly and neutrally name its presence. There is anger, there is defensiveness, there is anxious planning, there is rumination. Notice I didn't say, I'm anger, I'm feeling defensive, I'm anxious. You're noticing its presence, and you're not identifying with it. You're not fusing with it. And this is useful because it shifts your attention from content to process. So instead of following the narrative that anger supplies, attention registers the presence of anger, and with it, the fact that the mind is interpreting and reacting. Labeling loosens your identification with the thought or emotion. When a state is recognized as simply a state, it's less likely to dominate the entire field of your awareness. Over time, this practice strengthens your metacognitive abilities, the ability to observe mental activity as mental activity. As that capacity grows, internal modules lose some of their automatic authority. They continue to speak, but they're no longer assumed to be in charge. There's also evidence that effective science that naming emotions recruits regulatory circuits in our prefrontal cortex, and that can reduce our amygdala reactivity. In practice, the first effect most people notice is modest but meaningful. A fraction of space appears, something like tapping the brakes in your car. And that fraction of space is often enough to change the emotional tenor of the moment for you. The aim is not to eliminate strong reactions. We can't do that. We're human beings. We're always going to have reactions. But the aim is to be able to recognize these states earlier and to be able to preserve judgment as a governing faculty of our conduct. So the practice is simple. When you're meditating or going about your day, and a disruptive thought or emotion takes hold, pause for a few seconds, label its arrival, and then bring your attention back to your task at hand. If you're meditating, your breath or your object of focus, or just back to your work. So mindfulness makes these mental movements a lot easier for us to see. Stoic philosophy focuses on what we do with those things. And so it's a very helpful complementary philosophy and practice for people who are working on mindfulness. Mindfulness and Stoicism are sometimes described as parallel traditions that developed independently and arrived at similar conclusions about perception and the nature of suffering. That narrative has become more complex as scholars have documented actual cultural contact between Hellenistic Greek culture and South Asian philosophical traditions. For example, think about Alexander the Great's campaigns into India. Trade routes really expanded during that period, and intellectual exchange was possible. So there's very likely some degree of cross fertilization that actually occurred. It's not just kind of cultural syncretism. For our purposes, what matters is that both traditions place disciplined attention and disciplined judgment at the center of human freedom. Both examine how perception becomes suffering and how unexamined judgments amplify our distress. Stoic philosophy offers a particularly clear account of the process. It describes a sequence. An event presents itself in our mind as an impression. The mind either endorses or revises that impression through assent, and then emotion and action follow. And it's also helpful because Stoic philosophers and teachers didn't develop these ideas, from places of great ease. They weren't in ideal, calm settings where they developed this philosophy. They developed it under very demanding circumstances. Marcus Aurelius governed during plague, famine, military conflict, and political instability. He had an extremely stressful job. His meditations read as personal working notes, ongoing attempts to discipline his perception, resist impulsivity, and exercise authority with restraint, and also to live a happy life. Epictetus approached the same problem as a teacher of Stoicism. He started as a slave who was beaten so badly his leg was maimed. So he was someone who had known great suffering. And then he became a teacher who instructed students entering public life. And he focused repeatedly on how the mind moves from perception to action. An impression, in his language, is the way a situation initially appears. This is insulting, this is dangerous, this is unjust. Impressions can arise automatically and can be immediately persuasive. What concerned Epictetus was assent. Assent is the mind's endorsement of an impression as accurate and decisive. Once assent is given, emotion and conduct follow very quickly. His discipline was to pause long enough to examine the impression before endorsing it. And one of his exercises was to remind oneself internally that an impression is simply an impression and not identical with the thing itself. This reminder slows endorsement and restores wise judgment. In Stoic analysis, emotional disturbance reflects an evaluative commitment. So anger depends on the judgment that one has been wronged in a way that demands retaliation. Fear depends on the judgment that something external constitutes decisive harm. Anxiety depends on the judgment that a future outcome will determine one's safety or standing. The Stoic task is to bring those judgments into view. Epictetus also emphasizes role. A recurring question in the discourses, which document his teachings, is one who is in a given situation. It's to ask yourself, what situation are you in? Are you a citizen? Are you an advisor? Are you a parent? Are you a friend? Are you an official? And then your conduct and the quality of your conduct is measured against the obligations of that position, that role that you're playing. And role fidelity provides orientation when an interpretation begins to pull judgment off course. In legal practice, in a contentious exchange, the impression, this is disrespect, may arise instantly. The discipline lies in examining that interpretation before it settles into conviction and then starts to drive our conduct. What actually occurred? What does my role require? Does escalation serve the client's interests or the integrity of the record? Is this person just projecting? Placed alongside mindfulness, you can see how it's complementary. Mindfulness increases awareness of impressions as they arise. We can see that movement in our minds through quiet meditation. And the Stoic practice directs our attention to the judgment embedded within those impressions and subjects it to scrutiny and examination before action follows. Early Buddhist sources approach the same terrain through sustained awareness of how quickly narrative forms and how readily our identity fuses with that narrative. Reactions are observed early enough to prevent them from governing our speech or conduct. For lawyers, this type of discipline is really consequential because the rules that we play are consequential. Advice can alter the trajectory of a family, a business, a person's liberty. Strategic decisions determine exposure and protection. The written language we choose becomes binding obligation. And so the cumulative effect of small decisions is often larger than it appears to us in the moment. So in our work, interpretations matter. The mind moves quickly from what has occurred to what it means and then to what must be done. Fatigue shortens our patience, anxiety distorts risk assessment, and our ego can quietly enter into professional disagreement. When an interpretation settles in, it begins shaping tone, strategy, and the range of options that appear to us. Stoic discipline addresses this by directing attention to the judgment embedded in our reaction and asking whether the interpretation is consistent with the role we need to play. Buddhist practice approaches the same terrain by training sustained awareness of the mind's tendency to construct narrative around experience. So the pressures obviously are never going to disappear from our profession. But what can change is the speed with which interpretation is recognized and the habit of examining it before it shapes our response. Over time, the examination becomes steadiness, a pattern of conduct that reflects judgment rather than impulsivity. So one micro practice we can do that the Stoics would like is recalling one's role. So we looked at how attention and interpretation function. In his discourses, Epictetus repeatedly asked students to consider who they are in a given situation and what the obligations of that role require. In legal work, several identities compete for control in moments of friction. The part of our mind concerned with status, the part that wants to win the moment, the part that wants to defend competence in the eyes of others. Role recall introduces a stabilizing reference point for us. So the question is very simple. It's what is my role here? And what conduct would be consistent with that role? So when you're feeling yourself getting activated, you can simply ask yourself this question, pause, and this will help refocus your mind. A second Stoic exercise concerns how attention and effort are allocated by us in our minds. Epictetus begins the Enchiridion with a simple but demanding observation. Some things are within our control and some things aren't. Within our control are our judgments, intentions, and actions. Outside of our control are our outcomes, reputation, and the behavior of other people. And then there might be things that we influence, but we don't ultimately control. Legal practice constantly obscures this distinction because the work is organized around results. Lawyers are trained to pursue outcomes, winning a motion, persuading a court, reaching a settlement. Yet outcomes never depend entirely on one's own effort. They're shaped by institutions, opposing parties, judges, clients, and contingency. And when attention becomes fixed on what cannot be fully controlled, our mind circles around questions that cannot be resolved by us in the present moment. And then anxiety starts to follow, frustration starts to follow. So the Stoic exercise is simply to clarify the boundary between what's a good investment of your attention and what your mind can simply release. So it's just, if you want to do it right now, you can bring to mind a matter that's currently occupying your attention and generating some mental strain. And for a moment, simply sort the elements of that situation into two categories. First, what depends on your judgment and your conduct, your preparation, your reasoning, the clarity of your communication, how you engage with the situation. Second, what depends on other actors or external factors, the decisions of others, the eventual outcome, and circumstances beyond your control. And then you simply allow your attention to rest for a few breaths on the first category. What is under your control? What falls within your responsibility? This exercise doesn't remove uncertainty from the work, but it clarifies where your effort is actually effective, and it gives you permission to drop the weights on the things that you cannot govern yourself. Once attention and interpretation has become a little more visible, another question naturally arises. How do these disciplines influence the way we perceive the people we encounter in our professional roles? Legal practice often occurs in adversarial settings, but the profession itself exists within a broader civic structure. Courts, contracts, regulatory systems, dispute resolution mechanisms, they all serve public purpose. We represent particular interests, but the work takes place within institutions designed to resolve conflict and maintain social order. Operating within these institutions requires a psychological capacity that many philosophical traditions recognized as essential. The ability to prevent perception from narrowing into hostility or personal grievance when conflict arises. Stoic writers approach this problem by emphasizing the social nature of human beings. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself that human beings are made for cooperation. His reflections frame individuals not as isolated competitors, but as participants in a shared civic enterprise whose conduct affects the functioning of the whole. Buddhist traditions also developed a parallel emphasis through the cultivation of compassion. In this context, it's a disciplined orientation that allows one to perceive others more accurately when resentment or hostility would otherwise narrow the way we view others. Modern research has also begun to examine compassion empirically. Psychology, neuroscience describe compassion as a trainable orientation that influences both perception and our physiology. One mechanism involves the autonomic nervous system, particularly the vagus nerve, the same nerve we try to stimulate with that 4-7-8 breathing that invites our parasympathetic nervous system to activate. And higher vagal tone is associated with emotional regulation, social engagement, and greater stability during interpersonal stress. It's also been studied to show that people who have higher vagal tone behave more altruistically, more regularly. Compassion practices appear to influence these systems and improve our vagal tone. Research using heart rate variability suggests that cultivating concern for others increases that parasympathetic nervous system, like I said, and supports calmer interpersonal responses rather than defensive reactivity. At the cognitive level, compassion also alters interpretation. When intention includes the circumstances affecting other people, the mind is less likely to default to narratives centered on personal threat or injury. For lawyers, this doesn't mean weakening our advocacy or surrendering a position. It means recognizing that the people we encounter, clients, judges, opposing counsel, are colleagues. They're all operating within constraints and pressures of their own. When that recognition is present, disagreement is less likely to become unnecessarily personal. Seen in this way, compassion functions as another exercise of professional agency. It widens the frame of perception before interpretation hardens into reaction and behavior we might otherwise regret. A brief practice that builds on this idea is what we might call expanding the frame. When tension arises in a professional interaction, the mind narrows quickly around personal impact. We start to focus on what the other person's behavior means for us, our credibility, our competence, our position in the exchange. These interpretations form rapidly, and then it starts to shape our tone and our response. This practice can help interrupt that narrowing by deliberately widening the context in which the interaction is being interpreted. So you can bring to mind a professional interaction that involves some tensions. It could be negotiation, a very difficult conversation, whatever it is. And you just notice the immediate interpretation that forms. What story does the mind begin to tell about what is happening? I'm thinking of a situation right now. And all you need to do is then widen the frame slightly. Consider that other person's circumstances. What pressures might they be operating under? What constraints or incentives might be shaping their behavior in that moment? Finally, widen the frame a little more. Recall the institutional purpose of the setting itself. This interaction is occurring within a system designed to resolve disputes, maintain public order, and allow competing interests to be addressed through law rather than escalation. When we widen the frame like this, our perception often becomes less reactive and more proportional. We can see the situation with greater clarity, and then all of a sudden, the range of possible responses start to expand and become broader. A traditional compassion practice that illustrates this orientation is loving kindness meditation, often referred to as metta in Buddhist circles and meditation circles. Practices such as focused attention reveal something humbling about our own minds. With even a few minutes of quiet observation, it becomes clear how quickly our attention jumps, how rapidly interpretations form, and how often reactions arise before we've even had a chance to examine them. So much of our mental life actually unfolds automatically, and then we're frequently carried by it without noticing. Seeing this more clearly can change how we view other people, not just ourselves. When we recognize how messy and reactive our own minds can be, it becomes easier to understand that other people are often operating under the same conditions, responding to pressure, habits, and interpretations in ways that they may not actually be able to fully see themselves. In Buddhist traditions, loving kindness meditation developed as a way of deliberately strengthening this broader orientation toward others. The practice trains the mind toward goodwill and non-hostility. It's not about manufacturing an emotion, but cultivating a stance that counterbalances the mind's tendency to interpret others primarily through threat, grievance, or competition. The practice begins by extending goodwill towards oneself and then gradually widening that circle to include others. The premise is simple. All of us are navigating pressures, habits, and our own limitations. When goodwill is present, people tend to act closer to their values and intentions than when they're operating from fear, resentment, and defensiveness. So over time, when goodwill becomes part of the mind's baseline orientation, resentment and hostility have less opportunity to dominate the way we interpret. Empathy becomes easier because the mind is less quick to assume that others are acting out of malice rather than their own pressures, habits, and blind spots. So we'll finish with this practice. And for this one, it's really important that you sit comfortably. So stretch, move your shoulders, release some tension. Make sure you're feeling very comfortable and relaxed. And it can also help to put your hand on your heart. This helps encourage the release of oxytocin. So sit comfortably and begin with yourself. And you bring attention to your own well-being. And we begin here because goodwill towards others is really difficult to sustain when our own relationship to ourselves is primarily harsh or punitive. So it's important to start with goodwill for ourselves. And you just silently offer yourself some natural good wishes, thoughts of goodwill, loving friendship and kindness and compassion. May I be safe. May I be healthy. May I experience well-being. May I be free from suffering and experience peace. And allow that goodwill to settle, small kindling that you can continue to grow. And next, bring someone to your mind who you love very, very easily, who you love unconditionally, so easily. a friend, a family member, someone who has supported you and who you know also loves you, and offer the same goodwill to them. May you be safe. May you be healthy. May you experience well-being. May you be free from suffering and experience peace and joy. And from here, expand to a neutral person. Maybe colleagues you don't know, people you pass on your commute, and offer the same good wishes. May you be safe. May you be healthy and happy. May you experience well-being and be free from suffering. And then, if it comes naturally to you, don't force it, but if it comes naturally to you, you can extend your goodwill to someone who's been difficult, someone who may have harmed you. You don't have to force any affection. It's about recognizing the humanity of this other person, that they will also be of benefit to the world if they feel peace and goodwill. So offer the same wishes. May you be safe. May you be healthy. May you experience well-being. May you be peaceful. And then expand out in all directions infinitely. Your goodwill is not a limited resource. It is not a zero-sum game. There is an infinite resource of goodwill that you can draw upon and extend it to all beings everywhere. May all beings be safe. May all beings be healthy. May all beings experience well-being. May all beings be peaceful. So we do this practice because it doesn't mean we have to surrender any position or weaken our advocacy. We're cultivating an orientation in which we see people clearly as human beings of equal dignity, who are also working within shared systems, and that they're not obstacles or enemies. So to close, I'll just summarize what we talked about. The thread really is about professional agency, as I said, attention and judgment as disciplines that can be trained. And that training is a form of freedom of mind. Our work is cognitively demanding and socially pressurized. Our profession tends to reward urgency, certainty, acts of performance of control. Under these conditions, our mind is going to do what minds tend to do: interpret quickly, rehearse, defend, go over narratives. The practices we explored today are small ways of interrupting that momentum. 4-7-8 breathing provides a simple way to calm down our physiology. Others train attention itself. We do focused attention meditation to notice when our mind has been captured and to return it to the object of our focus. Labeling makes that mental activity very visible and disarms those thoughts and feelings. Stoic practices help us recall our role and reconnect our conduct with the responsibility that we're supposed to be delivering on. And the dichotomy of control clarifies where our effort is effective and where attention can be released. And then the final practices widen our perception, expand expanding the frame brings into view the pressures shaping the other person's conduct and the institutional purpose of the setting itself. And metta cultivates a stance of goodwill that prevents professional disagreements from collapsing into hostility or grievance. So mindfulness practice makes these movements of the mind much more visible. Thought appears as a thought, emotions appear as emotion. Stoic practices adds deliberate examination of judgment at the moment it's forming and reconnects conduct with our roles and responsibilities. And then compassion widens the frame further by reminding us that the people we encounter are also operating under constraints and pressures. Agency is about the capacity to regain authorship in the middle of activation. And when we do these practices on a regular basis, our minds become less governed by their own momentum and more capable of choosing how to proceed. And these practices are also where a more stable and enduring form of joy and well-being can emerge in our lives. The experience of inhabiting this work with greater steadiness, in line with our own values, in a way that helps us grow as people, rather than being continually carried away by its pressure. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. And if you want to contact, oopsie, didn't mean to do that. If you would like to contact me, please feel free to reach out to me, and I included these resources in the handout as well.
Thank you, Emily. I appreciate that. It's always a pleasure to see you and to experience your knowledge. I hope that everyone who was here and everyone who watches this on the recording benefits from this and takes you up on that offer. I can only speak from my own experience, but my mindfulness practice, my meditation practice, and the 4-6 breathing or 6-8 breathing, whichever way you do it, has been helpful. I would encourage people. One of our other speakers said, "Oh, you can do that like 4 or 5 times. 4 or 5 minutes, I think, is a sort of a minimum for that." It is kind of one of those things that you're doing it. And is this really working? Is this really working? Oh, I feel better. Max, thanks you for the for being here. Uh, and Max, reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you about being on our committee. And with that, thank you so much, Emily. Have a lovely week. Everybody else have a lovely week, and be well.
Thank you.